Okay, very good. This meeting. I'm going to uh, make this a little bigger so we're going to talk about politics from 1800 to 1824. Uh, we're going to talk about the Virginia dynasty of presidents, the Louisiana Purchase, the ongoing troubles with Native Americans and the English on the high seas that lead to the war, to the War of 1812. We're going to look at the decline of the Federalists and the court cases that marked the era. We're going to talk about the Missouri Compromise, the Monroe Doctrine, and the election of 1824. All of that is quite a mouthful, but we're going to start with the Virginia dynasty of presidents. There are 3 presidents that you need to know: Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. And they all serve for 2 terms. They're all from Virginia. They're all Republicans. And then, therefore, you can kind of know who's president in these 24 years if you can divide it by 3, which equals 8. So they were the Virginia dynasty. And Jefferson, the first of them that became president, was marked by the purchase of Louisiana, shown here in purple. That he sent his ministers to purchase New Orleans, but Napoleon only wanted to sell all of Louisiana. So it was purchased beyond congressional authority, but Jefferson went along with it and made the purchase and expanded the republic so that it would have another 200-300 years, they estimated, of independent farmers inhabiting Louisiana. So that was that case. There's another map of the purchase of Louisiana, and you can see the trail that was embarked upon by Lewis and Clark up the Missouri River, across the Sierra Nevada, across the Cascades, I should say, and all the way to Astoria, where they wintered in 1805 and made their way back the year of 1806. Here's a map that shows where Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader, traveled as he tried to put together an alliance of Native Americans to resist American expansion. That was just one of the troubles that would lead to the War of 1812. Americans convinced themselves that Native Americans would be their buddies, would be their friends, if it weren't for the British supplying them with weaponry. So that excuse more or less always bedeviled Tecumseh and the Indians as they worked to form an alliance to stop American expansion. The big area of tension with the English remained trouble on the high seas. The English would not let American ships trade with them, and the French wouldn't let American ships trade with England. But Napoleon was a diplomatic squirrel, and he followed policies that maneuvered the Americans into cutting off trade with England, and this led to the War of 1812. The War of 1812 went badly for the Americans. We invaded York, Toronto. We burned it down. We invaded Canada with 300 Kentucky riflemen who were rumored to be able to take that land, but of course they could not. Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun of Kentucky and South Carolina were nationalist war hawks who pushed for this war and reveled in the American victories at the end of the war. In 1814, the British got revenge on the Americans for by burning down Washington, D.C., by burning the White House, which was repainted white, by the way. And the final battle of New Orleans was fought 2 weeks after the end of the war, when the peace treaty had already been signed, but Americans hadn't heard about the peace treaty. And so this huge victory for Andrew Jackson led to a great deal of notoriety being impressed upon him. This shows the Indian Wars and the battles of the War of 1812. The War of 1812 marked the end of Native American resistance to American expansion. I said that they were on the warpath till 1815, and that's the case. And New England emerged as a manufacturing center, a bit in replacing British goods. Andrew Jackson emerged as the national hero after the Battle of New Orleans of early 1815. So the Federalists had come along by opposing the war and being against the war, seeing it as a regional war for their interests. But the Federalist Party died out because Republican presidents acted like Federalists. They expanded the power of the national government. So that was in line with Federalist thinking. They didn't win elections for many years, as you've seen. John Adams was their only president, and they disappeared over time as being perceived as a strictly regional party centered only in New England. And then their opposition to the war painted them as unpatriotic wimps. And that also contributed to their decline as a major opposition party to the Democratic Republicans. We'll skip the American system of Henry Clay and just go right to the court cases. These were all cases that were written by John Marshall, the most important Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice in our history. And in Marbury versus Madison, Marshall articulated the notion of judicial review, that Congress can declare acts, that the Supreme Court can declare acts of Congress unconstitutional. And that was a power claimed in 1803 in the case of Marbury versus Madison, and subsequently claimed many times in the late 19th, early 20th century. It's not claimed very much for History 17A. It'll be a potential check that the Supreme Court has on Congress, but it's not really used. The court case of McCulloch versus Maryland was a pro-federal government kind of ruling. Maryland had passed a law that taxed the Bank of the United States. And in this court case, the Supreme Court ruled that Maryland had no such power. The power to tax is the power to destroy. So by asserting national law over state law, the Supreme Court more or less laid the groundwork for the Civil War. And finally, it was a pro-business court. It passed a number of laws that reaffirmed the sanctity of contracts. A contract is a contract is a contract. There's nothing implied in a contract. That's why it's so full of small type and explicit language that businesses can use to dominate over individuals. So this was the theory of the sanctity of contracts, which lasted up to the 1870s. Now you can get out of a contract if it was fraudulently delivered to you. But the sanctity of contracts was such that this did not. It was very pro-business in the early 1800s. Okay, the Missouri Compromise was a crisis of 1820 or 1821 that alerted the politicians in Congress like a fire bell in the night that Missouri applying for statehood as a slave state, but the House of Representatives passed a law which was going to require Missouri to get rid of slavery in 25 years. Well, the South would not stand for that. And there was a standoff between the South and the North. Finally, Henry Clay worked out a compromise, the Missouri Compromise, that admitted Missouri as a slave state, admitted Maine as a free state. Maine, up to this point, had been a province of Massachusetts, believe it or not. So those two states were admitted, and there you see the Missouri Compromise line. The southern border of Missouri was at 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude. And the Missouri Compromise line said you can't have slavery north of that line in the future admission of states in the unorganized territory of the Louisiana Purchase. So this was something that limited the expansion of slavery. The Monroe Doctrine was articulated by James Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, which more or less said that the Western Hemisphere, which was going through a number of revolutions in the early 1820s, was no longer open for colonization, no transfer of holding to another European power, and there should be no interference in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere by Europe. In exchange, we said that the United States would stay out of European affairs, and this was the basis of the Monroe Doctrine. Well, the election of 1824 started really in about 1820-21 when James Monroe ran for re-election in 1820. He basically ran unopposed. It was obvious that he would win. But by 1824, the party that had been the Universal Party of 1820 had split into factions, with John Quincy Adams running from Massachusetts, Andrew Jackson running from Tennessee, Henry Clay running as the most important American politician who never became president, I believe, and Henry William Crawford of Georgia, who suffered a stroke during the campaign but still got 41 electoral votes. Stroke being pretty debilitating, but not always. Ha ha. Anyway, as you can see, Jackson got the most votes and the most electoral votes. And so he thought that he should be elected president when the House of Representatives met to decide that. But Henry Clay backed John Quincy Adams. And Clay, who could not be elected according to the Constitution, the Congress had to choose from the top 3 finishers in the Electoral College. Clay backed Jackson Adams, and Adams became the next president. The election of 1824 led to charges by Jackson that Clay and Adams had entered into a corrupt bargain for the votes of the country, and that he swore political revenge by forming the Democratic Party and riding his disappointment and anger at these politicians to victory in 1828. So the election of 1824 got Adams elected president, but he formed a willful opponent in Andrew Jackson and led to the formation of a party that would dominate the next 30 years or so of American history. Okay, that's the end of the lecture. I'd like you to think about what are the advantages of the United States having 2 political parties, and why do you think we're limited to 2? Anyway, that's it. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Take care.